What do you do when the people who should love you, who should protect you, are the very ones who destroy your life in ways that no one could ever imagine? In the quiet town of the Village, Oklahoma, there was a family that appeared like any other. A family that smiled, went about their daily lives, and waved to their neighbors. But behind closed doors, in the shadows where no one could see, something unspeakable was happening. For 2 long years, a young woman, vulnerable and disabled, was trapped inside the home she should have felt safest in. A home where the people who should have cared for her, her father, her brother, and even her mother, turned her world into a nightmare. What began as something hidden, a secret no one dared question, slowly escalated into a horror beyond belief. The very people who should have been her protectors, the ones who vowed to keep her safe, were the ones who betrayed her trust in the most devastating way. This isn't just another tragic tale of abuse. This is the story of a young woman who, for years, suffered in silence, unable to escape, unable to understand the depth of the manipulation and betrayal that surrounded her. A story that would remain hidden, until one shocking moment would force the truth into the light. But the revelation of this family's darkest secret, when it finally came, wasn't just a story of abuse. It was the unraveling of a family built on lies, deception, and a bond that should have been sacred. And when the truth was exposed, it was worse than anyone could have anticipated. This is a story about a betrayal that could have destroyed everything. A secret kept for far too long. And the consequences of allowing fear and silence to take control. What happens when the ones you trust most become the ones who hurt you most? And what happens when the truth finally breaks free? Stay with us, as we uncover what was hidden for far too long. Before we continue, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't. In the quiet town of the Village, Oklahoma, life was simple. Neighbors waved to each other, families lived peacefully, and crime seemed a distant thought. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone's name, and life moved at a steady, unremarkable pace. It seemed like the perfect place to raise a family, a place where nothing out of the ordinary could happen. But inside the Molden home, things were anything but peaceful. The house itself was unassuming, nestled among rows of similar homes. From the outside, it looked just like any other suburban house in town. But what was happening behind its closed doors would shatter the very idea of family and trust. At the center of this tragic story was the Molden family. Nathaniel Molden Sr., a man who preferred the shadows, who ran his household with an iron grip. He wasn't the type to engage in long conversations or show affection. His presence was one of strict control, and those around him quickly learned to comply with his rules. His word was final, and his temper was unpredictable. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention or love, he preferred dominance. His role in the family was never questioned. He was the unquestioned authority, and everyone fell in line. Then there was Tama Molden, his wife. A woman who had long been resigned to her role, a quiet figure in the background. Tama was known for her passivity, for allowing things to unfold around her without protest. She wasn't one to challenge Nathaniel Sr.'s decisions. Whether out of fear, resignation, or simple apathy, she chose silence. In a house full of tension, she was the one who never spoke up, the one who let the wrongs go unnoticed. And in the background of this rigid, controlled environment was Nathaniel Molden Jr., the son, who, to those outside, appeared to be just another teenager. But to those who knew the family more intimately, Nathaniel Jr. was a complex figure. His charm hid a darker side. Though he was the eldest, he wasn't tasked with looking after his younger siblings. Instead, he used his position to manipulate and control. His relationship with his sister would take a twisted turn, one that would set the stage for the horror that was about to unfold. But in this story, the most vulnerable member of the Molden family was the young daughter. She wasn't like her siblings. Born with an intellectual disability, she faced challenges in a world that often didn't have the patience to understand her. At times, it seemed she was a mere shadow in the house, unnoticed, her presence slipping into the background. She struggled to make sense of her world, of the people in it, and the things they did to her. Her vulnerability, her inability to speak up or fully understand what was happening, made her an easy target. Her disability wasn't the only thing that made her different. It was her trust, her unwavering belief that her family, the very people who should have cared for her, would never hurt her. But that trust, that innocence, would be the very thing that led her into a living nightmare. As time passed, the tensions inside the house grew, unnoticed by the outside world. On the surface, the Moldens were like any other family in the village. But in the shadows, something much more dangerous was happening, and no one could hear the cries for help. In the town where crime was rare, the horrors inside the Molden home went unnoticed by everyone but the family. They had their secrets. They had their way of pretending everything was fine. And for years, they kept it hidden from the rest of the world. This is the story of how the very people who should have protected her, her father, her brother, her mother, were the ones who failed her the most. It's a story of betrayal, manipulation, and a silence that would cost them everything. It's a story of a young woman who didn't have the words to explain what was happening, but who was about to find out just how far the people closest to her would go. The turning point in this story came in the most unexpected place, a hospital room. It was supposed to be a routine visit, nothing out of the ordinary, just a young woman in need of medical care. But what happened next would change everything. The young woman, now pregnant, sat in a hospital bed, confused, unsure of what was happening to her body. The nurses, trying to piece together the full picture, asked her a simple question: "Who is the father of your baby?" It was a question most people would answer without hesitation, but for her, the answer was anything but simple. She hesitated. Her eyes darted between the nurse and her mother, sitting quietly by her side. The silence in the room felt heavy, thick, as though something was weighing down the air itself. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "It might be my brother." The words hung in the air, too monstrous to be true. The nurse froze, unable to process the answer, and her mother, who had sat quietly by her side, remained eerily silent. In that moment, it wasn't just a revelation, it was a shock that would reverberate far beyond the walls of that hospital room. The young woman's words were like a sudden storm, sweeping away the thin veil of normality that had masked the abuse. It wasn't a boyfriend. It wasn't a stranger. The father of her child was her brother, Nathaniel Molden Jr. The truth, now laid bare, was too monstrous to comprehend. The young woman, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just been exposed, sat motionless. Years of abuse, years of suffering at the hands of the one person she should have trusted the most, her own brother, were now out in the open. The life she had lived, the world she had known, was shattered in an instant. Her brother's betrayal was not just an act of violence, it was an act that took away everything she had ever known. The love, the protection, the family bond she once believed in, it was all ripped away. In its place was a cold, harsh reality she had never imagined. How could her brother, the one person she trusted, the one who should have looked after her, do this to her? Imagine yourself in her situation, what would you do? For the young woman, the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. She had lived in confusion, unable to fully understand the abuse. She had been too afraid to speak out, too vulnerable to recognize the manipulation. But now, the truth was clear, and it was far more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The horror of those years, of the silence and the fear, had finally been exposed. Her mother, who had been complicit in her silence, didn't speak a word. Nathaniel Sr., her father, had known and yet had done nothing. The betrayal wasn't just from her brother, it was from every single person who should have protected her. And with that, the young woman's nightmare came into the light. The truth was no longer something whispered behind closed doors. It was real, undeniable, and it was going to destroy everything. The emotional toll of the revelation was staggering. Her trust in her family, in the very concept of love and protection, had been shattered. What was once her world, a world built on love and safety, now seemed like a cruel illusion. The young woman was no longer the girl she had been, she was someone who had lost everything, someone whose family had turned against her in the most unimaginable way. Her brother's betrayal wasn't just about physical harm, it was an emotional violation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The love she thought she knew, the trust she had in the people closest to her, was gone. And the hardest part of all was realizing that she could never go back to the way things were. Her world had been broken beyond repair. Now, the truth was out, and the horror was just beginning to unfold. Once law enforcement became involved, the full scale of the abuse began to come to light. The young woman, now in the care of social services, began to tell her story. Her words, though quiet and uncertain, carried with them the weight of years of suffering. The truth was no longer confined to whispers in a hospital room, it was now the undeniable reality that investigators had to face. And as they began to piece together the fragments of this broken family, the horror grew even more intense. DNA tests confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved. The child the young woman had given birth to was indeed fathered by her brother, Nathaniel Molden Jr. The confirmation brought with it a tidal wave of emotions, but for the victim, it was just the beginning of a painful journey into her past. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered even more disturbing evidence that pointed to a family dynamic fueled by control, manipulation, and neglect. It was clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a pattern that had been allowed to fester for years. With each passing day, as the investigation unfolded, more questions were raised. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How could a family, who seemed so ordinary to the outside world, have been hiding such a terrible secret? Law enforcement began to look at the Molden household through a new lens. What they uncovered was not just abuse, it was a chilling portrait of a family caught in a cycle of manipulation and emotional neglect. While the investigation moved forward, the emotional toll on the young woman was just as undeniable. Now safe and away from her abusers, she began to open up, but it was far from easy. The pain of her past, the years of isolation, and the terror of what had been done to her weighed heavily on her every word. Each memory she uncovered brought with it a new layer of trauma, a reminder of the years she had spent trapped in her own home. She had lived with a constant sense of confusion, unable to fully understand or articulate the extent of the abuse. The emotional scars she carried would take a lifetime to heal, if ever. As she spoke with the investigators, it became clear how deeply she had been failed by everyone around her. The people who should have protected her had instead been the ones to betray her trust. The emotional weight of her testimony, the raw pain that she revealed with each passing moment, was a reflection of how broken her world had been, and how long it had taken for the truth to finally be told. But it wasn't just the victim's trauma that was exposed. As police dug further, the silence of her mother and father grew more telling. Tama, her mother, had been complicit in her silence for years. Despite knowing what was happening to her daughter, she did nothing. She chose to look away, to live in denial, to protect her own comfort rather than protect her child. She had been a silent enabler, and her refusal to intervene spoke volumes about the dysfunction in the family. And then there was Nathaniel Sr., the father. A man who had known what was happening under his roof but chose to turn a blind eye. The same man who ruled his household with strict control, who maintained a facade of normalcy while allowing his daughter to suffer. He never once questioned his son's actions, never once stood up to protect his daughter. His failure was just as damning as the abuse itself. As the investigation revealed more details, it became clear that Nathaniel Sr. had prioritized maintaining control over his family, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the unimaginable pain his daughter was enduring. And Nathaniel Jr. himself, the abuser, was the one who had manipulated and controlled his sister for years. To outsiders, he had always seemed like the quiet, distant son, someone who didn't cause much trouble. But inside the home, he was a different person. He preyed on his sister's vulnerability, using her inability to defend herself to his advantage. His role in the family was one of dominance, and he used it to exploit the one person who couldn't escape him. His manipulation was not just physical, it was psychological, ensuring that his sister remained isolated, confused, and unable to fully grasp the horror of what was happening to her. As the investigation continued, law enforcement pieced together the horrifying truth: the Molden family wasn't just a family caught in a cycle of neglect. It was a family where silence was a weapon, where manipulation was an everyday occurrence, and where the very idea of love had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The emotional scars on the young woman were deep, and the psychological toll on the rest of the family was just as damaging. The investigation would reveal the truth, but the real work was just beginning. The community, shocked and horrified by what had unfolded behind the closed doors of the Molden home, was left to process the aftermath. The silence that had protected the family's darkest secret was finally broken, but the damage had already been done. As the police continued to build their case, one question lingered: how could something so horrifying have been allowed to happen in a place where it should have never even been possible? The truth was finally out, but the emotional cost of this revelation would ripple through the lives of everyone involved, especially the victim, whose journey to healing was only just beginning. Then, the moment of reckoning arrived. Law enforcement, armed with the undeniable evidence they had been gathering for weeks, stormed the Molden home. They arrived early, their presence disrupting the quiet suburban life the family had once tried to maintain. It was the culmination of months of investigation, months of digging through lies and deception, and now, it was time for the truth to face its consequence. The arrest of Nathaniel Molden Jr. was swift, as officers moved in with purpose. His protests of innocence rang hollow, his denials of what had happened falling on deaf ears. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, there was no question now. He was the father of his sister's child, and he had subjected her to years of abuse. He was led away in cuffs, his face a mask of disbelief, his words faltering as the weight of his crimes became undeniable. But the truth didn't end with him. Now, if you condemn the action of Nathaniel Jr. on his sister and believe his arrest was justified, subscribe to this channel. If you've anything to say, tell us in the comments below. His parents, Nathaniel Sr. and Tama Molden, were also taken into custody. Theirs was a different silence. While Nathaniel Jr. had been the one to carry out the abuse, it was his parents who had allowed it to continue, who had known about it and done nothing to stop it. Their inaction spoke louder than any words could have. They had failed to protect their daughter. They had failed to intervene, failed to act when they saw the signs of abuse, and failed to defend their own flesh and blood. They, too, were arrested for their role in the neglect, their complicity in allowing the abuse to go on unchecked. The emotional toll on the victim was immediately apparent. She had been trapped in a world where the people who were supposed to protect her, to love her, had instead torn her life apart. The weight of that betrayal, of realizing that the very family she had trusted had been the ones to harm her, was crushing. Her life had been stolen from her, her childhood erased by the very people who should have cared for her. As the news of the arrest spread, the community was left in disbelief. How could something so horrendous happen right under their noses? How had no one known? The quiet town of the village had prided itself on its close-knit, seemingly perfect families. But now, with the truth exposed, everything seemed to shift. The very notion of what constituted a safe home was called into question. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that even in the most unsuspecting places, terrible things could be happening in the shadows. The victim, now free from her abusers, was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. She had been robbed of her innocence, her family, and her future. The years of silence, the years of pain and isolation, had taken a toll on her. She was now in the hands of professionals, who would work tirelessly to help her recover from the unimaginable trauma she had endured. But no amount of time could undo the emotional scars that had been left on her soul. She would never be the same. The aftermath of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. It was impossible for anyone to look at the Molden family in the same way again. What had once appeared to be a normal, functioning family had been exposed as a facade. And the tragedy wasn't just limited to the victim, it had affected everyone around her. The community had failed her by not asking questions, by not stepping in when they should have. The justice system had finally intervened, but for many, it was too little, too late. As Nathaniel Jr., Nathaniel Sr. and Tama Molden faced the consequences of their actions, the young woman was left to rebuild her life. The road to recovery would be long and filled with challenges, but at least, for the first time in years, she was no longer alone. She was no longer trapped in a world of lies and abuse. The truth, though painful and horrifying, had come to light. And though justice had been served, the emotional consequences of this revelation would echo for years to come. The Molden family had been torn apart, and the victim was left to find a new sense of hope amidst the wreckage that remained. As she began the painstaking process of recovery, a constant question loomed over her: could she ever truly heal from the betrayal of the people she had trusted most? The ones who should have loved her, should have protected her, had instead shattered everything she had known. No amount of therapy, no amount of care, could erase the fact that her family, her own flesh and blood, had turned their backs on her. How could she trust again? How could she rebuild from the ashes of her broken life? For anyone who heard her story, how could this go unnoticed for so long? How could a family, living in a small, tight-knit community, keep such a devastating secret under wraps for years? The young woman had been trapped in that house, suffering in silence, for far too long, and yet no one had stepped in. Neighbors, teachers, and even friends, no one had questioned what was happening behind closed doors. How many other victims were out there, suffering quietly, surrounded by people who should have cared but didn't? In the end, the victim's journey to recovery is only just beginning. Though she is now safe, the emotional toll of her years of suffering will remain with her for the rest of her life. Her family's betrayal, the years of silence, and the deep scars left by the abuse will never fully heal. But she is no longer alone. She is no longer trapped. And that, at least, is a small step toward the possibility of a future that no longer exists within the confines of fear and manipulation. And as for the Molden family, their legacy is now one of betrayal and failure. The truth has come to light, and there is no turning back. The consequences of their actions will follow them for the rest of their lives, but for the young woman, the question remains: how does she rebuild? How does she reclaim the pieces of her life that were stolen from her, and how does she trust again? The case of the Molden family is not just a story of abuse, it's a story about the failure of those who should have protected the most vulnerable among us. It's a reminder of the importance of listening, of paying attention to the signs, and of speaking up when something doesn't seem right. For one victim, the healing journey is long and uncertain, but for all of us, the question remains: how can we ensure this never happens again? And more importantly, how do we prevent tragedies like this from happening again? The silence, the neglect, the failure to act, it all contributed to the unimaginable suffering of a young woman who had nowhere to turn. But now, the truth is out, and the only way to prevent such horrors from continuing is to make sure they are never ignored again. What do you think could have been done differently? Were there moments where intervention could have saved her from years of abuse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your reflections, your opinions, and your thoughts on how we can all play a role in stopping abuse before it starts. Your voice matters, and your perspective could help someone else who is suffering in silence. If you or someone you know is in an abusive situation, it's time to speak up. The silence only perpetuates the harm. It's time to break the cycle. Reach out for help, whether it's to a trusted friend, a professional, or a local organization. Don't let fear keep you trapped in a world of pain. There is always someone who will listen, always a way out. Speaking up is the first step toward reclaiming control, toward stopping the cycle of abuse that too many have suffered from in silence. This story is one of many, but it's also a call to action. We can all do better. We must do better. Whether it's educating ourselves on the signs of abuse or simply listening when someone reaches out for help, we all have a role to play in creating a safer world for those who feel they have no one to turn to. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that expose the truth behind closed doors and shed light on the voices that often go unheard, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and stay engaged with us as we continue to bring attention to the important issues that need our collective action. Stay informed, stay aware, and always stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Together, we can create a world where no one has to suffer in silence. Thank you for joining us in this journey. Your awareness can make a difference. Now, let's make sure that the story of this young woman is not just one of tragedy, but one that sparks a movement toward change.